Welcome back, everyone. In the last video, we introduced this language called C and looked at a very simple program that just printed some text onto the screen. And while this program might have been simple, the syntax was certainly cryptic, especially if you've never worked with code or with this language. However, we learned that we can use a program called a compiler that's going to take our source code that we wrote in a file that ends with .c and convert our source code into machine code that the computer can understand and execute. Now, if you haven't watched that video yet, make sure you check it out so that you understand everything we're going to talk about in this video. There's going to be a link to it on your screen and also in the video description. I'm here in my Ubuntu virtual machine, and I have that same program that we wrote in the last video. And we focused mainly on line 5, where we have this printf function. We learned how we can pass a string, such as hello world, to this function, and as a result, that string is going to be printed onto the screen. In this video, we're going to try to understand some of these other lines, specifically the first line at the top, this #include stdio.h. And to do that, we're going to induce some errors in our code, so that you can see what happens if we don't have this line, and because you are no doubt going to run into some of these errors at some point. So I claim that we need this line of code up here for our program to work properly, but let's take a look at what happens if we just delete it and try to run our program. I'll delete this #include line and try to compile this program. So let's go ahead and delete this line up here. We'll save our file. And then we're going to open up a terminal, and we're going to recompile this program using gcc-o, hello, and hello.c. And we are immediately met with some crazy looking error message. So essentially the compiler did not like something that we did, and it's going to try to let us know something went wrong via these error messages. Now frankly, these error messages were not designed with beginners in mind, and they can look very cryptic, but over time you'll get familiar with the vocab used. If you look close at this first line of error message, you can see that it's saying that our error is in the function main, which is kind of a spoiler because we haven't discussed this yet, but main is apparently a function, and it is indeed a special function that we'll discuss further in later lessons. But let's focus on this second line here. Next, you'll see hello.c:5:5. And this is telling us that our error occurred in a file called hello.c on line 5 at character 5. In other words, our error occurred when we tried to call this printf function. Next, you'll see warning, implicit declaration of function printf. So apparently the compiler doesn't like that we've used printf. And it's going to highlight the line of code where our error occurred right here. Next, you'll see this note, include stdio.h, or provide a declaration of printf. And what this is really saying is that the compiler doesn't know what printf is. And it's going to give you a suggestion that it thinks would solve your problem, which is to include stdio.h. Now this is all to say that in order to use the printf function, we need to include this file stdio.h. And these files that end in .h are what's known as header files, and they contain the information that the compiler needs to utilize a function like printf. We can include these header files in our code using the #include syntax followed by the header file that we want to include. You'll learn what functions live in which of these header files over time, but suffice it to say that printf lives in stdio.h, which stands for standard input and output, or in other words, printing to the screen or reading input from the user. Now generally, there are other functions defined in these header files. For example, in stdio.h, one of the functions is called printf. There's another one that's called scanf, but we'll learn about that one later on. And it turns out that output, like printing to the screen, is pretty easy to do in C. However, input is a little trickier. Languages like Java or Python and these higher level languages make input easy. However, in C, we have to understand some other concepts before jumping right into that. Now, some of these header files are part of what's called the standard C library, and they're going to come included when we downloaded this language called C. However, there are also third-party libraries that other people have written and given us the ability to use. We'll learn about how we can use these header files, as well as how we can build our own header files and the benefits of that. But for right now, it's important that you understand that we can include these header files in our code if we want to use the functions that are defined inside of them. Now, you're going to hear the term library from time to time, and a library is just a collection of these header files. For example, the standard C library contains files like stdio.h, among others. And we're going to use these libraries to help us solve problems and ultimately to help us learn this language. So I know that was a lot to explain just one line of code, but it's very important to understand that we don't get much for free per se in this language called C. If we want to use functions that someone else has written, we're going to need to utilize one of these libraries. And this begs the question, how do we know about these different libraries and functions? And the simple answer is that you would have to learn them from reading documentation or taking a course like this. The last thing that I want you to understand is that this #include statement is what's known to the compiler as a preprocessor directive, which might sound like gibberish, but all that means is that the first step the compiler takes when converting your source code to machine code is that it will look for any lines of code that start with #include, and it's going to find the file, such as stdio.h, somewhere on your hard drive, and essentially copy and paste it into your code where this #include line is. So now you understand this first line, and we also understand this printf line. We also got a teaser that this main is in fact a special function, and we'll look at that more in later lessons, but to summarize, we have the ability to include header files in our code, which is going to provide a definition for certain functions to the compiler so that it knows what to do when it comes across a function like printf that we haven't specifically defined ourselves. The keyword #include is known as a preprocessor directive and is just a clue to the compiler that we need to include this file in our code when we go to compile it. In the next video, we're going to introduce something called variables. And variables are going to let us store data in the computer's memory so that we can manipulate and change it. And also data types, which let us define how we want the data in memory to be represented, be it a number like an integer, or a character, or maybe a color or sound. I hope you understand everything that we learned in this video, and if there are any questions, please feel free to post them in the comments section. Thank you so much for watching, and if you got some value out of this video, make sure to hit that like button so that I know you want to see more content like this.